folks, and welcome to the show. I am your host, Charles Max Wood, and this is going to be an episode that we're going to just use to fill in a couple of the things. And mainly, it's an opportunity for me to talk to you about what devchat.tv is all about and what I'm working on.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
I want to kind of back up and just talk a few minutes about how I came to the conclusions that I did. And also, I've had a few people ask me to tell my podcasting story, so I'm going to kind of get into that as well. All right. I plan to do this in a few other places, primarily around YouTube. I'm working on some applications that people can use to build their own podcasts. And essentially the idea is that there are a few things that fuel podcasts on that particular front. Mainly it's audience and attention, money, through sponsorships or Patreon or whatever, and things like that. And so I'm going to be talking about how to get all that over on some other shows that I'm going to be starting here within the next few months. But in the meantime, I'm going to be talking about the podcast at devchat.tv. So if we back up a few months, and this year has really been crazy with travel for me. I got to the point where I was talking a lot about podcasting at MicroConf and at the Codebeam San Francisco in February. And while I was there, especially at Codebeam, I met a whole bunch of people and was talking to them about podcasts. One of the people was Johnny Wynn. And he had a show called Elixir Fountain. And it was a show that I think he intends to bring back. And as we were talking, it just turned out that there was kind of this disconnect between his ability to spend the time producing the show and his ability to pay somebody to produce the show. And so eventually he kind of slowed down, just to kind of keep pace with what he was capable of doing. And then eventually the show stopped, which to me is kind of a shame because I like hearing what he has to say. So we had him on Elixir Mix and we talked about the show and, some of the guys there were fans of his show and things like that. And so it really got me thinking a lot about the fact that there are shows that are started for some of these communities that just disappear. About the same time, I started looking around for other shows that might be disappearing. And one of the ones I found was the Food Fight Show, which is a show about DevOps. Run by the folks from Chef. If you've been involved in the Ruby community for a while, you probably know Nathan Harvey and Nell Shamrell Harrington and the efforts that they've done over there. And it was a terrific show too, but it had also kind of started to fade. And with them, it was just all of the work that went into making the show go. And I thought, okay, well, if I can solve the production issues, help them refocus the show a little bit so that it's a little less chef focused and a little more DevOps focused, which after talking to them sounded like kind of where they wanted to go anyway. And, could solve some of these issues, find some sponsors to help pay for the production and everything else, that we could keep the show alive. And so, we've kind of been working on that as well. And so I started reaching out to other shows about getting them onto devchat.tv and helping them continue to be out there. And, it's always an interesting balance to strike right between, okay, well, I'm putting in work on the show. My team's putting in work on the show. So how much do I take and how much do I not take? And, how much do I reinvest in the show versus, investing in the infrastructure behind the show and things like that. And pay myself for my time and stuff like that. And so that's an interesting conversation to be had. But most of these folks really just want to keep the show alive. And that's ultimately my focus as well. So I started talking to people around those ideas at Codebeam, and then I went to MicroConf. And at MicroConf, I started talking to people again. And it was funny because I was talking to people about the software as a service that I'm building for podcasting. And before long, we'd wind up talking about podcasting and about their desire to create a podcast for their niche community. And there were a bunch of people there doing a bunch of different things, and they were all really, really interesting problems to be solved. But a few of them, as I talked to them, it became readily apparent that they really could do a solid marketing campaign through a podcast. One example was the folks from Cleverific, I think it was. I think I talked to somebody named Andrew who had listened to Ruby Rogues because, he wrote apps for Shopify or plugins for Shopify, which is mostly done in Rails. And so we were chatting, and he had listened to some of the shows, and I was like, well, why don't you do a show about Shopify? And he's like, well, that sounds like an interesting marketing opportunity. Tell me more. And so as we got talking, it became apparent that, hey, look, there aren't a lot of shows out there about being a vendor on Shopify. And there aren't a lot of shows out there that talk about Shopify plugins. And the trick was talking to them, I realized that they shouldn't do a show on what their plugin does. What they should do a show on is being on Shopify and being a Shopify vendor, because then they add all this value to their customers, and then their customers come to know and trust them, and then they'll buy their plugin, right? And so I had that same conversation 4 or 5 times and realized that there could be this sense of serving the community, but also in a way that comes back to you and your company and things like that. And so if your heart and soul really is in the community that you're trying to serve, then you can make it work for you. Now, the flip side is that it also occurred to me that then I ought to have some products that I can put out there so that as people come to know and trust me and trust the shows that we put out on DevChat, that they have something to go to, right? And so it was kind of the reverse thing the other way. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, but I wanted to put things out there that really serve the community, right? Even though they were mostly money-making ventures, and I do make some money on the sponsorships, ultimately the idea was to get that going. And so that's kind of coming to fruition now with Everywhere JS and Everywhere RB and some of the other stuff that I'm working on at the moment. The Get a Coder Job book, I felt driven to finish that, right? And so now I rebranded it as Find Your Dream Coder Job. But anyway, so you get the idea. I've been putting these things out there, but I was starting to get an idea of really where I wanted to go with devchat.tv at that point. And so as I worked through some of the ideas behind DevChat and podcasts and community and what I really wanted, I wound up going next to NGConf, and that's the conference in Salt Lake City for Angular developers. And it's the big one. It had like 2,000 people there. And I have the benefit of having podcasted about Angular for like 4 or 5 years. And so I know a lot of the people who were there. And so I wound up doing a whole bunch of interviews and stuff with people while I was there. And I kept having the same conversation over and over again with people again about the podcasts. And finally, I had somebody ask me, so what are you trying to do with devchat.tv? And I thought about it and I said, well, I'm still formulating that, right? Because before it was, well, I want to empower developers to, make a difference and find freedom in their careers. And that's something that I'm looking for as a result of the podcasts. But I didn't really feel like that was the mission per se of devchat.tv. That's the mission more of each show, right? Is to help people level up and, find the job that they want and gain the skills that they need so that they can be successful in what they're doing, and that they can find freedom to move from jobs they don't like to jobs they like, and I feel like in a lot of cases too, some jobs, let's just face it, some jobs suck. Some jobs don't suck if you fit well with them. And some jobs are really great if you fit well with them. And I found that a lot of people, it's more of a fit between the person and the company or the person and the team than it is that job really sucks all around, right? It's just they provide more of what one person's looking for than another. And so what I want people to be able to work to gain the skills that they need so that they have the flexibility to move to the job that they fit the best. And then ultimately the jobs that suck will either figure out that they suck and they'll figure out how to do better, or they won't be able to hire anybody because everybody else is doing well and where they want to be. And, they'll have to figure something out. And so that's kind of where I'm hoping each show can get each community to. But for devchat.tv itself, it felt off. The mission didn't really fit. And so as I was talking to people, I started out telling people we liberate software developers to build, to find freedom and build the software that makes a difference. And by the end of the conference, I was telling people my mission is to make sure that every programming community has a podcast and that every developer knows that there's a podcast out there for them. And the reason that I got to that was because I realized that, talking to, say, the Ionic crew, right? And they're saying, yeah, well, we started a podcast and we're talking about Ionic. I've talked to a few other people around, Thinkster.io. We do the production for their show, Dev Ed Podcast, which you should check out. It's really good. But it's that kind of thing where it's, okay, how do I make sure that every community has a show? Because if every community has a place where they're having the conversations that community needs to have, and they feel like they can join in, and even though they can't participate fully in the conversation, that somebody is saying what they're thinking and answering the questions that they have so that they can gain the skills that they need to move ahead, then that's what we're about. But every community deserves to have a show. Every community deserves to have good content that's going to get them there. Funny enough, I just talked to somebody a few minutes ago about possibly adopting a cold fusion podcast. Talk about technology that you think nobody uses anymore. But apparently there are a number of people still out there. And I assume with most technologies, there's always going to be some code out there that somebody wrote that needs to be maintained. And maybe one of these communities, something's going to come together and pop up and make a big difference for them. Maybe cold fusion will come back because somebody invents something over there. I don't know. But ultimately, having these communities out there is something that's really, really important to me. And so I've really started working on that as a whole, and that's driven me to start a bunch of new shows. So some of the things that I thought I might just talk through here for a few minutes are some of the shows that I want to start. And then I'm going to go back and I'll talk through my coding journey. Specifically with Ruby Rogues, I keep getting asked the same thing. I'm probably actually just I may just tell that story instead and just answer that question as part of the podcast community. But we'll see where we wind up. Anyway, so interestingly enough, when I started working on new shows, the shows that I wanted to start were some of the up and coming technologies that I feel like are getting close to the verge where one solid breakthrough or one bit of technology that goes mainstream is all they're really waiting on. One of those is AI and machine learning. So in artificial intelligence, we keep hearing about it. More and more people are getting into some of the learning models and, they're learning languages so that they can go work on it and things like that. You keep hearing about, TensorFlow, and I think Microsoft has an AI initiative, and I think AWS is working on, something similar, right? So you can train systems to figure out your stuff, right? And so that kind of machine learning is going on in a lot of places. And again, we have these very specific AIs, but they seem to really, in a lot of ways, intuit their way into ways of solving problems. And so as those algorithms get better or faster, I think eventually we're going to get to the point where a lot of things are going to be driven by AI that we wouldn't even think make sense to do by AI. And what's going to happen is we're going to get to the point where people are seeing it show up. So maybe my toaster has AI in it, right? And so from the way that I push down the little button to put the bread in, it'll know that it's me, and it'll know that I like my toast a certain way, right? So after so many times of me fiddling with it to get the toast just right, it's going to take that feedback enough to know, oh, okay, it needs to be about this doneness, or it needs to cook for about this long, or something, right? It's going to have some value in it for that. All the way up to solving some of these other problems that are hard to put an algorithm around, but can kind of have this, hey, I fed you a whole bunch of data. Now, what about this? And so anyway, I think we're going to see those get faster and better and more intelligent. And so as we kind of work through that and figure that out, I think we're a good few years from that just taking off. And so I wanted to do a show about it. Similarly with IoT, a lot more devices are coming out. I consider also things like the Amazon Echo and some of the features in smartphones to be essentially IoT functions. And so as we get there and it ties back into things like serverless functions and things like that, we're going to see a lot of things change, I think, over the next few years there too. Just from the sense of having these devices that are capable of doing a lot of things. And then as they collect data and we feed it back into the AI systems, right, you kind of get the idea that it'll figure out what kind of patterns and what kinds of things it should be reacting to. And then all of a sudden we have this interactive world that kind of happens around us without us really realizing it. And then the last one that I see kind of up and coming, and I think is probably, 5 years or so out, is virtual reality and augmented reality. And I've been telling people for a while that we already have augmented reality. The problem is that I have to pull my phone out of my pocket to use it. Right. So I can interact with the world around me. I can take pictures of things. I can scan QR codes. I can, so right now it's very, very analog, but I think we're going to get to a point where a lot of that really connects and something's going to click and it's all going to happen. And a lot of that's going to be driven by data science. So we do have a data science show that's starting. That show is actually being run by David Richards from Ruby Rogues and his friend Rex Griffiths. And they've already recorded like 3 or 4 episodes. So we're probably going to get those out here within the next week or so, if it's not already out. And I'm recording this at tail end of May 2019. So if you're a few months from now, go check it out. It's called Data Therapy. Right now, we're just finalizing the details. We're getting the artwork done. We're getting some intro and outro music. And we're just hammering out the rest of it and figuring out what we want to do. So anyway, I'm super excited about that. But that I feel is going to drive a lot of the other ones. And then the other area that it seems like a lot of this is happening in. So IoT kind of happens across several technologies, but AI is primarily done in Python. And so, and then a lot of data science, incidentally, is also done in Python. So I want to start a Python show. And I've been talking to a number of people about getting that together. Now, the shows that I've had people approach me about since I said, oh, well, we're starting shows for communities, especially where people really just want a show and they can't find more than maybe 1 or 2 good ones, are Java. And I actually went looking for Java shows and most of them have stopped. I found a couple shows that were like Java with so-and-so, and it's essentially, hey, I'm a coach or I'm a therapist or I'm a this. And so it's essentially saying coffee with so-and-so, and they're not talking about programming. Most of the rest of them that talk about Java have stopped. And so I was surprised because it's a huge community. There's a ton of code being written in it. There's a ton of code that has been written in it. I don't think it's a technology that's going anywhere. And there are a lot of people that work with it. And so I am talking to a number of people about getting that show together. And then I had Sean Claybo he was a guest on JavaScript Jabber. He came to me and asked me about doing a .NET show. And I thought that was a good idea too. I know the guys that do the .NET Rocks show. I know a few people that do like Azure focused shows or Microsoft focused shows. But yeah, I want to get in and talk about the .NET ecosystem. Now, I'm probably not the guy to do that. I'm not an expert there, but I can support these people in pulling together a show that will talk about that. And, I can do everything except be the expert. And so that's the area that I'm working on there. Like I said, I had somebody come to me talking about a cold fusion show. I've had a couple of people, I'm trying to think of all the other ones. Like I said, we adopted the Food Fight show and a lot of these other podcasts. I'm reaching out to a bunch of other defunct shows that aren't producing anymore, to see if I can bring them on board and either bring them onto devchat.tv or help them find sponsorship so they can run on their own. JavaScript seems to have shows popping up that are creating kind of a vibrant community. Angular has a few shows, and so we have shows in Angular and React and stuff like that. Elixir, the only show I'm really able to find. I found 1 or 2 others that are, fairly new, like mine, like Elixir Mix. But yeah, anyway, so we're working on getting all that together. So I guess that's a long-winded way of essentially saying that we're starting new shows. If you're working in a community that doesn't have a podcast and you think you would like to see a podcast for it, reach out to me. Just email me, chuck@devchat.tv, and let me know, hey, look, we'd like to start a show on whatever, and we'll get it going. I'm also working with Joe Eames to start a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. That probably won't be on devchat.tv. I'm trying to figure out where that's going to live, because I'm also starting shows with my kids. My 13-year-old wants to do a show on Lego Ninjago, which is a television show. My daughter loves writing songs, but she's not really a trained musician. And so we're going to talk to songwriters, and I've made a few contacts that can really help me out on that front. If you know any songwriters, I'd love to get connected there too. My 10-year-old daughter, we're going to do a Harry Potter show. And with my 7-year-old son, we're going to do a Star Wars show. And then I'm probably going to wait for my 3-year-old to get a little older before we start a show with her. But anyway, so those will probably all live on the same network, all of those, and the Dungeons and Dragons show. And we'll, if anybody else wants to start kind of the family focused or entertainment focused shows, then I'm happy to work on that too. But anyway, so that's been a ton of fun to work on as well. But yeah, so we're working on these shows, definitely trying to get this stuff together and just make sure that we have shows out there for everybody. And then on the helping everybody know that there's a show out there for them, so I built a podcasting booth. It's 9 foot by 9 foot. And it has 3 windows across the front. I have a banner that goes along the top that says, hey, DevChat podcasting booth. I'm working on a few other things to kind of get things together. And then I'm really hoping to go out to programming conferences with it. I took it up to NGConf and just record a whole bunch of podcast episodes at the conferences and see what we end up with. And so I'm excited about some of the prospects there as well. So that should be really interesting to see what comes together out of that. But just being present at the conferences, I think, will help raise the awareness that there are podcasts out there for programmers that are there specifically to help them learn. And, Joe's Dev Ed podcast is there specifically about how to learn. My shows are more specific about what technologies, tools, techniques, career advice, things like that you can use to get ahead where you're at. And then a lot of the other shows that we're putting together, again, are in some of these specific areas. So what I'm hoping to do is create resources so that, let's say, in another few years, the web becomes VR and VR becomes the web, right? Then you all have a resource to go to if you need to make a job transition, or IoT or AI or whatever. And so as people kind of make these moves, because the web didn't exist 20 years ago. Well, it barely existed 20 years ago. And, I think things are prone to change. So if we have the content out there, then we can continue to make what we're making and do what we're doing and have great lives as programmers. I also started a video show called the DevRev, stands for the Developer Revolution. And again, that was more along the lines of freedom and career and things like that. And I am looking for career questions that I can answer on that show. And I'm probably going to start it up again here within the next week or so. So anyway, lots of things going on. And this is all back to that same idea around every community in programming deserves to have a podcast. And so let's get one out there for them. Another area was Go. There was a Go podcast that was being produced by the guys over at Changelog. And they started it back up. It was funny. I emailed them and asked them about it, and then like a week later, I got an email back saying, "Hey, we released a new episode." So good to know, right? If I'm not taking any credit for that. Even if it did prompt them to do it, I mean, they did the work. So, but I don't even know if that was the case. They may have already recorded it before I even reached out to them. But yeah, if there are shows that you're finding out there that you're like, "Gee, I wish this was still a thing," let me know, because there may be a way for us to make it work. But yeah, and then it's okay. So how do we keep people current? How do we keep people at the point where they can really shine in their careers and, make it a quality experience for them? And that's where Everywhere JS and Everywhere RB come in, is that I wanted to create communities where people could actually come in. They could hear talks like we hear at users groups. They could talk to each other. And so I'm kind of doing roundtable. I'll have to moderate that in some way. But roundtable discussions, and so we'll bring people in and out, and, they can ask questions, they can get to know each other, things like that. And then, have forum and a Slack chat where people can actually get in and interact with each other. And I've been working hard on that, just getting the rest of that kind of bolted together. And that's something that will probably be available in June. But I definitely am waiting to get a few hundred people on each of the wait lists, just so that I know that I'm going to have kind of critical mass in the community, just so that I can do nice things for the people that come and speak. And so that I know that the conversations aren't going to be between 10 people. It'll be between 100 or so people. So anyway, that's what we're looking for. And that's what we're working on. Now, I've had a few people ask me how I got into into podcasting. And I'm going to kind of just give a long-winded, story about it, and just explain where it came from and how I got into it and everything like that. I'm probably going to get into some areas that I have not discussed publicly. And I'll let you know when I get there. For Ruby Rogues, it basically involves Mandy Moore and the panel and some of the stuff that went on there. I will let you know that my intention is essentially to record this, talk through it, and then I am not going to discuss it. I'll discuss it one-on-one with people, but I'm not going to go public and discuss it again. So just so you're aware, this is a question I get asked a lot, especially by the Ruby Rogues community. And, I'm going to tell my side of it. It may be skewed in my favor a little bit because that's just the way I see that things happened. But yeah, anyway, but let me go all the way back. So, just so you're aware, I was the kid. It's funny because they had like radio classes and DJing classes in high school and college, and I never took any of those. But when I was a kid, I remember I got a tape cassette recorder and I would record my own shows on cassette tapes when I was like 9 or 10. And, smart kid like me, of course, I did it on the stairs where my brothers and sisters would bother me because they were going up the stairs or down the stairs, right? And so I'd yell at them for bugging me in the middle of my show because I wasn't smart enough to go in my room. But I did stuff like that. And I don't know if that had any influence on it at all, but I distinctly remember doing that kind of thing. When I was in high school and college, I thought it would be cool to be a DJ, but like a radio DJ, not like a DJ at the dances and weddings and stuff, but, a DJ on the radio. But I never really, I never really focused much on it after that. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, like a physician doctor in high school. And at the same time, I got into electronics. And so I did a bunch of stuff with electronics. I got my ham radio license in high school. And I've always kind of been bent toward technology that way. My grandpa was a chemical engineer. He worked for Rockwell International in California, which is where my mom grew up. And I remember going over to his house after he had retired. They moved back to Utah. And I remember going over to his house and he had a little TI computer. And, he was tinkering with stuff and would invent stuff on his own. One of the things he invented was an ellipsometer, which for those of you who don't know, is a tool for measuring the layers of oxidation on silicon wafers, which is what chips and computers are made out of. And the way that the chips are made is essentially they etch into the oxidated layer on the chip. And, I learned a whole bunch about that when I was in college because I got my degree in computer engineering. At the same time, for computer engineering, of course, I had to take some programming classes. I also worked in their operations center. So initially at BYU, so my degree is in computer engineering from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And so when I worked there, we just would, monitor the servers. We would log in and fix stuff if we needed to. Similarly with all of the network switches, the Cisco switches around campus. If there was a problem with any of those, we typically were the ones that would log in and fix them. Sometimes we would send out technicians. So we would just log a request and the technician would go check it out. And then they'd call us if, they needed diagnostic information off of the switches. That was essentially our job. While I was there, they built a fully fledged data center. It's actually underground between the Talmadge building and the Knight building on BYU campus. And you wouldn't know it walking over the top of it, but it's there. And it was huge. And so, we moved into basically a state-of-the-art operations center while I was working there. After several years, a friend of mine helped me get a job. The same friend that helped me get a job there helped me get a job at doing systems administration work. So when I got down there, I was on the team managing the Windows and NetWare servers, and then moved over to Linux and VMware. There was an internship in the middle of that where I was actually working for a company writing software or writing patents. And I figured out pretty quickly that that wasn't the life for me. That wasn't what I wanted to do. So I went back and they gave me a job back there working on VMware and then eventually on Linux. And I actually wrote a system in Bash that allowed the servers to copy the updates. So we had a license from Red Hat for the servers, and so we'd get updates straight from them. But every server would have to go and rsync the updates down and do all this work one at a time. And so I wrote basically a script that ran on a cron job that would go and one server would pull down the updates, copy them to the other servers, and then there was another cron job that ran all the updates. So we only had to download them once, and it happened on a regular basis and helped us manage all that stuff. So I was kind of into programming at that point, but most of my programming classes were pretty pointless. And for the most part, I thought programming was kind of a joke. And eventually, right before I graduated, I started applying for jobs and got hired at Mozy. And when I was working at Mozy, that's where I really fell in love with programming. And it's also where I first encountered podcasting. So I got hired over there. Incidentally, the CEO of that company, I found out after working there for about 2 months that he was actually my second cousin, that his mom and my mom were cousins. And for whatever reason, we just didn't realize that until I was talking to my grandmother, and she had heard from her sister that, that her grandson had started this company. And it turned out it was the company I was working at. So funny side note, but anyway. So what happened was we started building a system to manage the requests that we were getting in Ruby on Rails. And Ruby on Rails is what they were using for the website of things at Mozy. And so we could get help when we needed it. But for the most part, we were pretty self-sufficient. And initially, a guy named Tom did most of the work, but he eventually transitioned over to the sales team to be their tech support lead guy. So he would hop on the sales calls with them and help answer questions about things once we started getting business and enterprise clients. And so a lot of it fell to me. And so I just continued working on the same project and learned Ruby on Rails while working on that project. And we built that out over about a year and a half. And then that's when I decided, because the company had been acquired by EMC Corporation, and they were asking me which track I wanted to be on, because I had kind of been on a dual track of both technical or engineering and management. And so initially I was thinking, oh, well, I'll just go into management and I'll be a, C blah, 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 O. And I realized that I just loved programming. And so I went to my boss and I essentially said, look, I just want to be a coder. I just want to write code. And he said, well, I don't have the clout to move you over to the engineering team, because they had a really high bar, and they also had enough pull in the company that they could essentially, turn anyone away they wanted. And their interview process was pretty intense. So I moved over to QA. And I worked in QA for about 6 months before I left Mozy. But while I was in QA, there was another guy there named Don. And Don, he had been commuting down from Ogden, which is an hour and a half north of where the office was. And it was just far enough to where he would actually get an apartment, and he would stay at the apartment all week, and then he would go home on the weekend and see his wife and his son. And so on the long drives and everything, he had bought himself an iPod. And they were the ones with the circle control and an actual spinning disc hard drive in them, and had like 80 gigs on them or something. And anyway, he was listening to podcasts, and finally I just turned around because he was cracking up at something on like Grammar Girl or something. And I said, what are you listening to? What are you laughing at? And so he pulled out his iPod and, played it back for me. And then I'm going, oh, this is cool. Well, I wish I had an iPod so I could listen to podcasts. And he laughed again and helped me get iTunes running on the Mac Mini that was sitting on my desk, because through some form of serendipity, I wound up being the guy that was running the Mac beta for Mozy when they were adding the Mac Mozy, or Mozy for Mac, to the product offering that they had, because before that it only worked on Windows. The client only worked on Windows. I mean, the back end, it didn't care, as long as it got the data. So the machine I was beta testing on was the machine that I was running iTunes on, listening to podcasts. And so I listened to a bunch of different shows, some of the ones that he had been listening to. I think I picked up a couple of NPR shows like Wait, Don't Tell Me, and a few other ones that I enjoyed. And I went and looked for Ruby on Rails podcasts. And it turned out that there was one out there called Rails ND. And Rails ND was run by Greg Pollock. A lot of people know who he is because he started and sold Code School to Pluralsight. And he currently runs Vue Mastery, I think is anyway. But he also runs the official Vue News podcast. So he's still out there doing his thing. And I think his Vue Mastery is the one that he owns. There are a couple of Vue training sites, but I think that one's his. So anyway, I emailed him and I thought, podcasters, they're like movie stars. And, it's crazy because you could do a podcast in your basement. And, I just didn't realize that. So I emailed him and I thought, this guy's probably, got a zillion things going and he'll never email me back. And I heard back the next day. And he said, you should definitely start a podcast. And I emailed him back and I said, well, what do I do? Because I don't want to do the same show you're doing, right? I figured there was only space for one solid Rails news podcast. And he told me to start interviewing people. And so episode 1 of the Rails Coach podcast, which was the show I started back in 2006, 7? No, it was 2008, I think. Anyway, my first interview was Greg Pollock. And then I did an episode. I didn't have a guest, so I just talked about what I was learning about Ruby on Rails and just talked through the principles there. And then the next episode, I interviewed James Edward Gray. And then I, just kind of went back and forth like that, so there'd be an episode or two of me talking about what I was working on, and then an interview or two from, some of the other folks that I was talking to. Some of the other shows that we did, I talked to DHH, I think it was episode 50 of the Rails Coach podcast. And that was actually an interesting encounter. I was walking through RailsConf and I saw him sitting there and I saw there was a seat open next to him. And so I sucked it up and I walked over and I sat down and I was super nervous. And I just introduced myself to him and told him that I loved Rails. And he was gracious. I'm sure he'd heard it a million times. And then I said, I'd really like to get you on my podcast and just talk about Rails and talk about your story. And he agreed. And I was totally dumbfounded. And so I emailed him after the conference and we worked it out and he came on the show. And, so that was a highlight. I wound up going up to ApacheCon one year and interviewing a whole bunch of people about open source stuff. We interviewed people about ladies learning code in Toronto on that show. Eventually I renamed it to the Teach Me to Code podcast. And the reason was because about 2 months before I started that show, my friend Eric Berry, who has been on the Ruby Rogues podcast for a while. He's also on the Sustain Our Software podcast that's going to be coming out soon. I think I failed to mention that one earlier. He had started a screencast series for Ruby on Rails developers, and he was trying to duplicate Railscast, is what I found out later, but it didn't come through the same way. And that's fine. It was definitely a good show, but anyway, after I'd been podcasting for a while, he came to me because he had gotten really involved in Groovy and Groovy on Grails. Which Groovy's a language that runs on the JVM. And so he's like, look, you've been producing content pretty steadily. Would you like to take over Teach Me to Code? And I said, sure. And so I took it over and I started producing videos every week as well. And after a while, that kind of turned into a thing as well. And so that's more or less how I got to know people in the Ruby community, was because I'd go to conferences and I'd get involved in the community, and they knew who I was because they'd watched my videos or heard me interview somebody, or I had interviewed them on the show. And so it was really kind of a cool thing. I think I interviewed Ryan Bates once or twice, who did Railscasts, and a bunch of other people. And I'm pretty sure all that content's still up. I think you can still find it on devchat.tv, I think is where it's at. So anyway, we got all of that stuff together and made it all work. And then in 2011, in April, things were starting to kind of wind down for me with regards to Rails Coach and Teach Me to Code. And I had also gone freelance the year before. I'd gotten laid off from my final full-time job after like 6 months. And I won't go into all the details, but essentially they hired a director of marketing that took the company in a direction that he had way more pull than he should have. And he took the company in a direction that made customers start to leave. And so, they were cash strapped. The board actually stepped in and fired some people and forced them to lay a bunch of people off. And so I was one of the people that got laid off. So anyway, about 8 months later, a tweet comes across my Twitter, and it was James Edward Gray, who I had mentioned earlier. I had interviewed him, I think, twice on Rails Coach. And he said, gee, I wish there was a panel discussion podcast for Ruby. And he was listening to a show called, I think, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe or something like that. And I'd been listening to the twit.tv podcasts, This Week in Tech, Windows Weekly, This Week in Google, MacBreak Weekly. And so I thought that, was pretty darn cool stuff. And so I'd been kind of thinking the same thing, but I had never really considered starting them until he put that out there. And so I sent him a message and I said, yeah, let's do it. And so we reached out to the people we knew. We got Peter Cooper from Ruby Weekly, Cooper Press. He also does JavaScript Weekly and a bunch of other ones now. We got Aaron Patterson from the Ruby and Rails core teams. David Brady was a friend of both of ours. And it turned out that he actually lived in my neighborhood at the time. Go figure. And I think that's pretty much the whole crew when we started. And so I went and bought the domain and set up the website, and initially I was editing the shows, which meant that I was putting intro and outro music on there, and unless somebody told me to edit something out, that was pretty much all I did. And then I wound up hiring people and things like that, and I can talk a little bit through that in a minute. But anyway, so we started Ruby Rogues, and that was in May of 2011. And it was really great. I mean, a lot of people were totally willing to come on and just chat with us about the show and talk about what they were working on in Ruby. So we got people who were building different Ruby distributions. We talked to people who were working on different parts of the Ruby ecosystem. We would just talk about stuff ourselves a lot of times. After the first 8 or 9 episodes, I think both Peter and Aaron had said that they were super busy and didn't have time to do the shows anymore. And so we brought in Avdi Grimm and Josh Susser, and that kind of made up the core group for a while. And then after 100 or so episodes, Katrina Owen, who had been a guest a couple times, she actually joined the panel as well. And so we did that for a while until Josh quit the show, and and things kind of went from there. About 6 months later or so, Jameson Dance, who's a local developer, I knew him from the Ruby community, but he had gotten deeply involved in JavaScript. He came to me and said that he wanted to start a show like that, except for JavaScript. And if I remember correctly, initially I was just trying to help him get it going. And then eventually I just wound up pulling it all together. I think he was busy with work stuff and life stuff. And so I wound up pulling that show together and running it. AJ O'Neill, who's on the show now, I think he's the only other original panelist. Joe Eames started 20 or so episodes in, and then everybody else has come in since then. At the same time, I started the Freelancer show, and I don't think there are any original people on that show. And I actually retired from that show about 2 years ago. So, but yeah, so we started that show, and then about a year and a half later, I decided I wanted to learn how to build iOS apps. And I never did, actually, but I was on that. I was on iFreaks for 4 years, before I finally retired from that show. Just, from the sense that I wasn't bringing a whole lot to the show. I mean, my technical knowledge was mostly from what I had discussed in previous episodes with other people. And so I bowed out of that.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/reactradio. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
Let's see. So my Angular adventures in Angular started a year or so after that. Joe Eames and Merritt Christensen came to me and basically said, "Hey, you should do a show on Angular." And I looked at them and I said, "Guys, I am doing too many shows. I don't have time for another show. So no." And they came back to me a few weeks later and said, "No, Chuck, you need to, we need you to help us start an Angular show." And I said, "Not doing it." After like the third or fourth time, I think I finally capitulated and said, "Okay, let's do it." So we started that show. And at that point, things started to get really hard as far as time management goes, because that whole time I had been freelancing on Ruby and JavaScript. And so I would pick up contracts and I'd work my contracts, and then I would work the podcasts. And with 5 running shows, I had also at that point hired Mandy Moore. And we found Mandy, Avdi had found her on Craigslist or something, and trained her to edit his show. He had a wide Teams show at the time, which was remote Teams. So she was editing his shows and doing his show notes and things like that. And I talked to her, and she started getting it done for me too. I had hired people before that to do that kind of work, and nobody panned out. People were dropping the ball all over the place. And when I hired her, she just got it done. And it was amazing. I must have told her I loved her like a dozen times in like 2 months. Cause I mean, every week it was like stuff went out on time. It got done right. It was terrific. And I think there was some push for me to hire her from the other panelists, especially on Ruby Rogues, because they were tired of shows not being released. In fact, somebody actually put up a website that was time since the last Ruby Rogues episode went out. And I think at one point it got up to almost a month. And so we did it. She pulled it together. She was doing a lot of terrific work, and I was super happy to have her doing the work. So we added Adventures in Angular, and then things got to the point where I didn't have time to do the podcasts and work contracts. And I had, I think, 3 contracts at the time for various different things. And, they were smaller contracts. So I had, maybe $1,000 from each of them as a deposit. And after 2 or 3 weeks of not being able to get any headway on any of their projects, I just return the money. And just told them, look, I'm sorry, I'll help you find somebody, but I don't have time. And that was a really actually difficult decision for me to make. I was, I had been supporting myself and my family off of the consulting for 6.5 years. And the podcasts were making enough to pay Mandy, and they were making a little bit, to pay me, but not enough to do both. And at that point, I prayed, I thought, I really, I looked around, and I finally just decided I had to make a decision one way or the other, right? I couldn't keep doing both. And so I went full time on the podcasts. And as soon as I made that decision and went out and started, finding sponsors in earnest and doing a lot of that other work, I was able to pay the bills, and it worked out. And I'm still shocked sometimes, right? Even though now I've been doing this full time for about 3 years. So 2 or 3 years, something like that. Anyway, so that things were going really, really well. I hired a business coach. I think this was right after things split with Mandy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, she told me, look, because I was out of ad space for JavaScript, Ruby, and Angular. And she said, well, just start another show on each of those. And so I started my Ruby story, my JavaScript story, and my Angular story. And I have to tell you, I really love doing those shows because I just get to talk to people, and I get to talk to people about what makes them, what makes them tick. And a lot of people identify with a lot of the things that people share on there. And so I really, really have enjoyed doing those. But that's how those ones got started. And so those were shows like 7, 8, and 9 on devchat.tv. And DevChat started to become an idea sometime after iFreaks. I had been talking to a few of my other podcast friends, and they essentially were telling me, look, you have a podcast network. You just don't have a podcast network. And my friend Tom Allen, who has passed away a couple of years ago. He used to do the podcamps out here in Salt Lake. He had this idea for a Twitter chat called DevChat, and he never did anything with it. And so I essentially co-opted the name, made it into a podcast network. And if he wanted to do a Twitter chat called DevChat, I was totally cool with that. But it never really came to be. And so anyway, so we pulled things together, and eventually I put it all on one website. And I built my own website in Ruby on Rails. I built my admin system in Ruby on Rails. I had a sponsorship management system that I'd built in Ruby on Rails. And all in all, it turned out to be kind of a dumb decision because it was a ton of work. And what eventually made me switch back to WordPress. So initially they were all on their own WordPress setups. And so I moved them all over to that website, that system. And then eventually I moved everything back to WordPress after my friend Derek Bailey was showing me what he was doing with watchmecode.com. And within like 2 days, I had almost feature parity with the devchat.tv system that I had built. And so anyway, it just turned out to be a good move, and it simplified a lot of things for me because I didn't have to maintain all this code. And, I paid a good deal of money to a developer to help me build it. But, in the end, it just turned out to not really be the right way to do it. Even though the developer was doing a good job and, it worked, it just wasn't ideal. So back to WordPress, that's where we wound up going. Incidentally, it's funny because now I'm actually working on static site generator type thing. And that has simplified things further. That's been a good deal of work, though, to actually set up. But once it's done, then adding features to it is just updating the HTML templates and then relaunching it, basically. And adding new episodes to it is just a matter of adding a markdown file to it. So I have a few other things I need to figure out on it, but for the most part, that's where things are. So anyway, just kind of an interesting side note on that. But anyway, so we moved everything back to WordPress. Now we're moving on to that. Incidentally, if you go to devchat.tv and it is the new website setup and you find a problem with it, you can actually submit a pull request to it now. That's the other reason why I switched it over, is you can submit a pull request and it'll fix whatever's going on with it. So, or if there's a typo in one of the show notes or, anything like that, that's kind of what we're looking at. So yeah, anyway, I'm pretty excited about that. Where was I at? So yeah. So anyway, so that's kind of where things ended up with a lot of that stuff. I want to back up and talk a little bit about the situation with Ruby Rogues and with Mandy. Both happened around the same time. They were kind of related, I guess. But anyway, I'm just going to explain things from my point of view. I know that there was a big Twitter stream that people posted at the time, which was like 2 years ago. And at the time, I didn't say anything, and I want to address this as well. At the time, I didn't respond to any of it. And the reason was primarily that I had seen incidents go down at different conferences and with different online communities where people didn't see eye to eye on a particular issue. And in some cases, it was clear who had been in the wrong. But what wound up happening was that people wound up taking sides, and then there was a ton of blowback both directions. And it just turned into this big fight, and it got really ugly. And I didn't want to be in the middle of any of that. And so I was more or less content to let them say their piece. And my response was essentially, if you really want to know my side of things, email me, we'll set up a time to talk, and then we'll just talk. And essentially it was off the record. But anyway, so the two kind of happened at the same time. And I'm going to go into some things. I got a lot of blowback about talking about what happened with Mandy publicly before. But I think it's kind of critical to understanding, at least to some degree, what actually happened. So we were looking at in March or April of that year, and I think it was like 2016. I want to say, I can go back and check, but I really don't care. But yeah, it was March or April. We started having discussions because things were getting to the point where I wanted her to, and I also want to preface this by saying that I have learned a ton about communicating clearly about what I want. And I think a lot of this just stemmed from my inability to clearly communicate to her what I wanted. And I never really had a problem with her as far as her performance went. It was more just that we didn't see eye to eye on the vision of things. So we were looking at things, and I was talking to her about potentially building out a team so that she could focus on a lot of the things that I saw that were more valuable than some of the things that she was spending her time on. And initially, when we talked through it, she was talking about building out a team for her own company, and then she would essentially just, provide services to mine, right? And so my team would essentially be her team. And initially, I agreed to that. And then I realized that really didn't fit with where I wanted to go as much as that I wanted to have people on my team, right? I wanted it to be my team, and I wanted her to run it. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I talked to people about it, the more I kind of came to that conclusion. And I think she felt like I went back on my word there some, and she's probably justified in thinking that. But that kind of started a little bit of tension in the relationship that we had. And she'd worked for me for a number of years before that. So anyway, it was interesting. Another thing that came out of it too was that she had handed off some of the work to a subcontractor, and she was paying that subcontractor considerably less than I was paying her. And and I told her this, I didn't feel like it was fair for me to be paying that much more for work done by somebody who was doing it for that much less. Unless she could guarantee the quality and stuff. And, and I wasn't convinced that she could. So, that all said, that caused some issues there. So we kind of had some back and forth. And at the same time, I was, and I still am, part of a show called Entre Programmers. And Entre Programmers is a show where we get on, it's a mastermind group, and we just get on and we talk about everything. And, there are some areas that we hold back on, but for the most part, especially then, well, we were very clear that we'd talk about anything, right? There were no holds barred. We wouldn't hide anything. And so we would talk through it. And so I discussed some of the tension that we were having, between she and I. And she became extremely, so let me back up. So she became frustrated about the response that I got on the show. And this is where, and I've talked to a few people since then who kind of went back and looked through it, and they're like, look, I see where you're coming from and I see where she's coming from. I haven't gone back and looked through it because it just hasn't been worth it. I don't care so much about being right. But anyway, so it was an interesting way it went down though. So my friend John basically just said, look, you gotta get rid of her. She costs too much. She's not doing what you're asking her to. And my issue was, well, the problem is that she's doing a lot of things that I don't particularly want to do. And she does a great job. I don't have any problem with her performance in the job. And he said, look, you've got to control this whole process. And that was another sticking point between she and I was that I wanted her to document all the processes that she was using to run my business. And she was digging her heels in because she felt like if she did that, then I could go find somebody, cheaper to go do the work and she'd be out of a job. And my intent really was to hire out that team and then have her do I think I was paying her like $50 or $60 an hour. And so I wanted her to be doing the $50 or $60 an hour work. And yeah, I'd hire somebody cheaper to do the $10 or $15 an hour work. So, anyway, so that was kind of the way that went. But yeah, they were, let's just say, unkind about the way that I should handle it, or handle the situation with her on the show. And, I didn't think much about it. I got a bunch of advice. I felt like I had, said my piece as far as I don't want to get rid of her because she does a great job. But it came up here and there over the next few weeks. And the tension with her started getting worse as well, which is, so I was bringing it up some as well. And, they encouraged me to let her go, which was still something I didn't feel like I wanted to do. And I didn't feel like she had done anything to, merit getting fired. And so, anyway, so that's kind of where things wound up. And then what ended up happening was, somebody told her that we had been talking about her on Entre Programmers. And to be fair, I thought I had told her that we did the show, that we talked about everything, and that she may at some point become a topic of conversation. And, she claims that I never did, which is also entirely possible because I don't remember when or how. I thought I had, but maybe I hadn't. So, just in all fairness, it's entirely possible that I hadn't. In which case, she whatever the case is, she felt like she'd been blindsided. And so, she basically felt like I had, maligned her, and that it was unconscionable on the show. I went back and listened to it, that particular episode at the time, because she pointed to that one and said, this is really hurtful. And I'm listening and I'm going, okay, yeah, what John's saying isn't very nice. And, what some of the other guys are saying, is in line with what John's saying. It's just sounds nicer. But every time I chime in, I'm telling them what a good job she does. And so I felt like, I hadn't stepped out of line. And, somebody finally stepped in and said, you shouldn't have talked about it publicly. And that's probably true. That's probably true. Or at least, I should have been explicit. Hey, look, I'm part of this mastermind. We're going to have this discussion. If you want it to be private, we can do that. But, they give me advice and so then I need some advice on how to handle this because, this isn't working out. So I did learn some lessons there, and I really shouldn't have discussed it publicly, at least not without talking to her first. But anyway, so that all came to a head in like August, and she finally I actually revoked her access to everything, got her on a call to tell her that it wasn't going to work out and that we should part ways. And she told me that we should part ways on the call. And so we, I don't want to say that I was about to fire her. I'm sure there's a nicer term for it when it's more of a, hey, this ain't working, right? Instead of you did something wrong. But anyway, so the reason that it connects to the other issue with Ruby Rogues. So in June of that same year, Avdi came in and said that he was looking at retiring from the show. And I think Saran was thinking about it. And so we were discussing who we should replace them with. And at the time, the other panelists were Jessica, David, Coraline, Avdi, and Saran and I. So that was the panel. And so I was like, okay, well, who, so we just kind of discussed it, right? Over email, who should we get? And there was a lot of back and forth. And several people put forward that if Avdi was going to go, we should replace him with somebody that was not white and not a man. And for the most part, I really don't care about that kind of thing. I'm not sure how to couch that in terms that's not going to piss some people off. But I really want to have a great show. And then all things being equal, let's get somebody that, looks a little different. But for the most part, I really enjoy the diversity of thought. And I think that was what made the show great when it was James, Avdi, Josh, David, and I were all white dudes, right? It was because we all come from very different backgrounds and we brought different ways of thinking about problems to the discussion, and sometimes the way that people looks, can indicate that they have a little bit of a different cultural or some other way of thinking about it because they've lived through things that, the rest of us haven't, is I guess the best way to put that. But that's not always true either. So anyway, I said, look, as long as it's a great show, that's fine. But they didn't bring any names up. And so I brought up a couple of people that had either been co-hosts on other shows that, were Ruby experts and, or past guests or things like that. And, they nixed every one of them. And what was interesting too, is that up to that point, everybody on Ruby Rogues had been approved by the entire panel, right? So every time we added somebody to the show, everybody on the panel had basically been like, okay, we're good with that. And so I didn't press the issue, right? I didn't say, okay, well, we're taking them anyway, or I know they're good. And so we're just going to go with it. I totally went with, okay, well, then let's find somebody, but we've got to find somebody soon, right? And then they finally put forward somebody to come on, to be a co-host. And incidentally, we've had this person on the show since, and they were a terrific guest. So I kind of feel dumb about it now. And these guys are welcome to come back and say, told you so. But at the time, they said, well, she's been a guest on Ruby Rogues before. We think that she would be a great panelist. And I was like, all right, well, basically have her come on as a guest rogue. And if she does a good job, then I'm in, right? And so she came on the show and she didn't say very much. And, so afterward, I could kind of virtually feel them leaning in and going, so what do you think? And I was like, guys, she didn't talk. And, if she doesn't talk, she's not there, right? And so I'm just not excited about having this, because they found somebody that met their criteria, right? Not male and not white. So, it's a she at least. I was just like, I'm sorry guys, but I'm not excited about her. So, no. And because I own and run the podcast network, they felt like I put my foot down and told them to drop dead. Where in reality, I was just exerting my vote as a member of the panel and saying, sorry, but no. But anyway, so that all kind of got smoothed over, and we eventually added Sam Livingston Gray to the panel. Everyone was like, oh, we like Sam, so we added Sam to the panel. So after Mandy quit, I sent an email out to all of my co-hosts on all the shows. And I said, look, here's essentially what's going down. If you want to go look on Twitter, you can probably figure out, some of the deal surrounding Mandy, but she's not working for us anymore. And so I've hired this other company to do the podcast production, and so they're going to be handling it from now on. So just send your emails to me, and then I will, I'll work with the production company to get it done. Well, the production company turned out to not be a great company to keep up on and doing all of the work that we needed. They were releasing late. They failed to remove stuff, especially when during the middle of the show, we'd say, this needs to be removed. They would fail to remove it. And so, anyway, one of the episodes that happened on, Sam was particularly invested in. And so he came to me and he said, it needs to be fixed. And I'm like, yeah, it needs to be fixed. And so I went back to them, had it cleaned up. And then I think he reached out to Mandy. I had forwarded at that point Mandy's email address to mine, so that if any requests came in or anything was unfinished with her, that, I could handle it. And so he sent a request in. I told him that Mandy was gone. And he got kind of indignant about that. And then I think he went to talk to her and got her into things. And then, he essentially went to Twitter and said, this is ridiculous. Chuck should hire Mandy back. And so, I get an email from a friend of mine who says, you see this, right? And so I went and saw it, and I sent an email to Sam, and I said, Sam, that's not appropriate. You need to take it down. If you have a problem with the decision that I made, let's talk. But, starting a Twitter fight over this is not, is not appropriate. And he stuck by his guns. And so I said, fine. But if we're going to have a Twitter fight, then you're not going to be a panelist on Ruby Rogues. And that's when I actually did, as producer of the show, say, I'm making a call. So I kicked him off. I kicked him off the show. I got an email not too long after that from Coraline saying, you need to stop making unilateral decisions. And I was done at that point. I mean, he went after me on Twitter, and so I kicked him off the show. And then I heard from her a little bit later saying that she was quitting the show too. And then a couple days after that, I got emails from Jessica and David also saying that they were quitting the show. So, that's pretty much where things came down. And then they wound up starting a show called Greater Than Code, which I think is still running. I haven't really paid a whole lot of attention, so I don't know for sure. But anyway, so they went off and started their own show. I think Saran kind of felt caught in the middle of it, and she really didn't get involved. So I, I don't blame her for, making any decisions she made. I know she didn't go join them, and she didn't stay on Ruby Rogue. So I think she was just trying not to get caught up in the middle of it. But, anyway, so all of a sudden I was the only rogue standing. So, so I did the show with, Noel Rappin. I think we talked about his, money book, started reaching out to people, and we pulled together a new rogues panel. So I've had people ask what happened, and that's essentially the story. I'm not going to hash through this. If you leave a comment on the episode, I am not going to respond to it, but that's essentially where things came down. And I'm sure somebody has a difference of opinion on some of this, but, anyway, that's that's essentially the way that it went. So that's kind of been the biggest challenge. I did feel a little bit personally attacked at the time. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that was the right way to feel, but yeah, I didn't feel like responding because I really did not want to polarize people, make them take sides or anything like that. I just wanted to, I more or less really just wanted it to go away and just be able to rebuild. And I did not want to ruin any friendships or make any problems for the community or anything like that. So anyway, that's where things went from there. So since then, we started my Ruby story, my JavaScript story, my Angular story. About a year later, I sent a survey around and I asked people what they wanted. And I got overwhelming responses for React and Elixir. So I started shows on those, and Joe came to me and said, you should start a show on Vue. And I decided not to tell him no 4 times that time. So we started that show. On the editor front and the show notes front, I hired one company, and they lasted about 6 months before I just said, guys, I'm done. I can't take it anymore. You're delivering late. You're delivering poorly. And, you cost too much for me to have to hassle with this. So at the time, I had another friend who owned a podcast company, and I hired his company. Incidentally, both of these companies were run by people that I knew already. And they did it for about a year, and they also did not do a great job. So then I hired the editor for the Entre Programmer show, and he did it. It was kind of hit or miss for a while. He was delivering late as well, but he was doing much better job than the other editors were. And so eventually we got to the point where we were delivering on time, right? We were getting the shows out on time. And my issue was that I wanted to be a week or two ahead on the edits because, I was a little bit leery about getting them out late. And anyway, I also in that time hired, sorry, I blanked. At that time, I also hired Michelle, who is our podcast production manager at this point. And she's the one that lines up a lot of our guests and does a lot of that work. And anyway, so in December, I just finally had enough with that editor, and I let him know. I mean, he did a terrific job, and I think we had just kind of overwhelmed him. But yeah, he was always proud of himself for getting stuff out on time. And I always felt like, well, that's your job, be proud of yourself for getting us ahead. Like I've asked you like 4 or 5 times. So anyway, so that kind of, we parted ways, and I wound up hiring a couple of other editors, and those guys have been working for me since January, and they have been awesome. They have gotten everything out on time. They've actually gotten ahead a few times. And that's worked out well. But since there are 2 of them too, they can also cover each other. So if we have shows that are recording one week and releasing the next, one can get covered because the other guy is there to do it. And that has worked out tremendously well. And then I've hired a number of people to help write the show notes and schedule the releases and things like that. And at this point, at this point, Michelle runs most of those teams. So, or most of that team. So I mostly just work with the hosts, work with the sponsors, and then just kind of check in to make sure that everything's going out on time. And, things have worked out super well that way. I credit a lot of that just to, so I signed up for another coach this last year, and his name's Scott Beebe, and you can check him out at businessonpurpose.com. But he helped me get a lot of it systemized to the point where, a lot of it just kind of happens automatically. And I think that was a lot of the problem that occurred with the other folks that I had working for me before. And he's also helped me learn how to communicate better with my teams, which is, I think, what boiled down to a lot of the issues with Mandy and with some of these other folks. I essentially am admitting that I'm taking responsibility for this because in a lot of ways, it really boiled down to, my failings and my not understanding how a business is supposed to run and not understanding how to make it sustainable. So anyway, it's all worked out to this point. And so, yeah, now we're working toward making sure that there are shows out there for every programming community and doing our best to support the open source community. So anyway, that's probably way more than you bargained for. I'm sure that there are people who still have feelings about some of the stuff with Ruby Rogues and Mandy in particular. But overall, I've been asked a bunch about it. I wanted to put something out there so I could just say, hey, go, this is essentially the thing, right? And then you kind of have a definitive place to go and kind of get my take on things. And then, if you really care, you can go check out some of the other stuff too. But that's more or less my story to this point. My main focuses at this point are getting these new podcasts started, getting the podcasting systems even more streamlined, and then just nailing it for as many communities as we can. So if there's a community out there, like I said, that you want a podcast to be out there for, let me know and we'll see what we can do to get it going. Incidentally, a lot of the times when somebody says, hey, I wish there was a podcast about such and such a topic, I wind up asking them if they want to be a panelist. So if you want to be on a podcast, that's also a good way to do it. So that's kind of the long-winded explanation of how things went, and my journey into podcasting. There have been a few other bumps along the way, some things that weren't as public that I'm not going to go into. But for the most part, that's kind of how things have gone, and that's been my journey. And you're not doing it right if you don't screw it up a few times, right? So anyway, that's what we're doing. And I'm going to wrap this up, and I will catch you all next week. All right. So this is actually a separate recording from what you've listened to so far. I recorded that episode last week, and I realized that I hadn't covered everything that I wanted. So I'm just going to jump in here for a few more minutes and just talk through some of the stuff that I've just kind of been thinking about. So I talked through some of the things that were not fun to go through with the podcasts. I talked through some of the things that were a little bit controversial when other people were involved. They had different opinions. I kind of talked through some of the things that I messed up. And I realized that, I didn't really want to talk about it to get the story straight. I didn't really want to talk about it necessarily because people had questions about it. That was part of it. But what I really wanted to do is I just wanted to highlight some of the lessons in it, right? And one of the things is just that running a business is freaking hard, right? I've been doing the podcast stuff for full time now for a few years, and I've been podcasting for 10 years. And it's tricky. You have to be consistent and getting the episodes out consistently. You have to consistently follow up to find sponsors. You have to do the work. You have to get out there and actually do it. And I'm kind of hoping that I can highlight that and at the same time not make people feel like it's hard or impossible for them to go out and do something like this if that's what you want, right? So if you want to start a podcast, by all means, start a podcast. Sit down, figure out what it's going to take. Sit down, figure out when you're going to record. Sit down, figure out what you want to talk about. And then just do it. Just do the work, right? And that's kind of the deal, is just getting in and executing. The other thing is that a lot of people enabled a lot of this journey. And I want to highlight that as well, right? Greg basically said, go start a podcast. And I was like, okay, I asked him if it would work, and he said to go for it. And so, if this is your Greg moment, so to speak, right, where it's go start a show and, I guess I could, go for it, do it. The other thing, especially with the things that went down with Mandy and with the Ruby Rogues panel at the time, I really want to highlight some of those lessons too. One of them was just that I wasn't clear on what I wanted. I wasn't clear on where I was heading. And I think a lot of people mess this up, whether you have a traditional career or if you're doing something on your own like I am. It's really hard to figure that out. And it's also really easy to screw it up when you don't know what you want. And so, I messed things up. I didn't communicate clearly with her what I wanted. I told her one thing and then realized that wasn't what I wanted and came back and told her another. I messed up the way that I communicated about some of the other stuff. I shouldn't have talked about the situation with Mandy in public. The Ruby Rogues thing, some of that was my fault. Some of that I feel like was their fault. But ultimately at the same time, right, it was, I wasn't clear on what I wanted from my co-hosts, right? And I wasn't clear who I wanted as co-hosts. And so I got some people in who had an agenda that was very different from mine. And I'm not saying that they were wrong. I'm just saying that they weren't a good fit for where I wanted to go. And eventually that was what caused things to come apart. And so again, it was just, and this is the point I want to drive home, right? Is that you have to be clear on what you want. You have to be clear on what you want. You have to be willing to go out and do the work. And you have to be able to admit when you screw things up. And yeah, it's those are hard lessons to learn. Hopefully you can learn them just by listening to me instead of going and screwing stuff up. But ultimately, that was what I wanted to put out there. And I realized that after I had recorded it, I wanted to come back and just say, hey, folks, look, none of it's permanent, right? I found new co-hosts for Ruby Rogues. I really like these folks, right? I've got co-hosts that I've been recording with for 7.5 years, right, on JavaScript Jabber. There are a lot of good things out there, and you can't let the things that don't work out, knock you down. And if they do, get back up. And you also have to be willing to do the work. And one other thing is that, the podcast thing, like I said, I've been doing this for 10 years. And yeah, the situation today is different enough to where you can probably gain traction much more quickly than we did, 10 years ago or 8 years ago with Ruby Rogues. But the flip side of it is that you still have to do the work, because if it's easier for you to come in, it's easier for everybody else to come in. And so you've got to go in there and you've got to stick it out, and you've got to do the things that other people aren't willing to do. And if you can do that, then you can make the difference everywhere else. And that's one thing that I'm seeing now, where we're starting all of these new shows and we're making all of this progress with everything that we're working on, is that, again, right, we're doing a lot of things that a lot of other people aren't willing to do. And in some cases, we're actually taking over and rebooting or rebranding shows, right? And so we're adopting the RSS feed with the existing listeners, or we're helping them revitalize the show and find sponsors and things like that. But those are all things that those people really weren't willing to figure out how to do, because, and some people are going to, well, they just didn't know how, or that, they didn't have the connections you did. But the thing is I went out and did the work to get it. Right? I went out and did the work to meet people. I go to conferences and I go walk through the entire expo floor and I talk to people and find out who they are, find out what they're about, and see if they're a fit for our shows and all of those things, right? I reach out to people I don't even know, and I'm like, hey, we're trying to pull together a show about this thing. Are you interested? Right? And people aren't willing to go out on a limb sometimes. Some people are, and sometimes it doesn't work out. And I acknowledge that. But the thing is you still have to go do the work. You still have to go out and you have to get a bazillion no's before you get the one or two yeses that are going to make the difference. And so, I got kicked in the teeth on the Ruby Rogues thing, and I went and found new people. I got kicked in the teeth for screwing up with Mandy. And guess what? I went out and I found new people, and I worked through it, and I figured it out. And now we actually have written processes for everything. My people know exactly what to do. We communicate really well online. I mean, we had a team meeting this morning where my team actually got on and said, hey, we have these problems, one of which I was aware of, a couple of which I wasn't. And by the end of the call, we knew what we were going to do and who was going to do it. And the only part of it I was really involved in was saying, okay, who's going to do this? Right? The rest of it was all them solving these problems. Oh, we've had some hiccups with this. I think we should do this to fix it. Okay, let's try it. We'll try it for 2 or 3 weeks. And then if it causes other problems, then we can evaluate it. And if it doesn't, then it works. But, I had to go do the work. I had to go gut it out. I had to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours after when most people go home from work to make this go. And so the whole point is that, yes, it's an interesting journey. Yes, it's an interesting story. Yes, I did a whole bunch of stuff, that I probably didn't need to do. And yeah, I screwed a bunch of stuff up, but I didn't quit, and I went out and I did the dang work. And so if you want to start a show, come talk to me. I can probably make it easier for you. If you want to try something else, you want to go do Twitch streaming or writing open source or doing anything else, go do it. Figure out what's involved and go do it. Don't make the excuses. Now's not a good time. I was on an accountability call with some friends of mine this morning as well. And the one guy, he basically said, well, I haven't started running because it's not a good time. And one of the other guys called him out and he said, you said that it wasn't a good time before because it was Easter. And then before that, it wasn't a good time because it was coming up on Christmas. He's like, I'm sorry, but at this point, you just don't want to do the work. And, he kind of looked up and he was like, you know what, you're right. I mean, he was nicer about it and it was kind of a joking tone, but that's the truth is we make all these excuses for why we don't get what we want. And the reality is that we have to work for it. And that's where I'm at now, where it's like, okay, I see where this can go and I am going all in. I am all in, right? I'm going to go make a show for every programming community because they need it. And then I'm going to make sure that everybody out there who can listen to that podcast and get good quality information out of it and go get results in their life from it are going to find it and use it. And that's where we end up. And that's what I'm working on. And that's what gets me fired up is that I know that I can go out there and I can knock it out of the park and I can make a difference. And bonus, I can make a living doing it. So if you're listening to this and I can inspire you to go out and do something a little bit different, a little bit better, go try something new. Go for it. Go for it. Do it. I can't express well enough on this call how much that has made a difference for me is just going out and doing it, just doing it. And, I'm happy to help where I can, where I have time. I'm happy to jump on a 15-minute call with just about anybody, right? And so if you have a question and I can answer it in 10 or 15 minutes, let's do it. If you need more in-depth coaching, we can probably figure that out too. But ultimately, let's just go out there and let's solve this. Let's make a difference. We have a skill as software developers to where we can write software that will make just about anything easier to think about, reason about, handle, model, whatever. So go make a difference that way. If the way you want to make a difference is blogging, if the way you want to make a difference is podcasting or video or something else, go do it. Go see what somebody else is doing and do it. I have my friend John Sonmez. He ran simpleprogrammer.com, which was a blog that he primarily was writing on for a long time. And then he had a Simple Programmer YouTube channel that started to get really big. And guess what? There's another guy out there that went out there and he created his own website called Clever Programmer. And he's doing a lot of the same kinds of things that John was. He basically copied him. Guess what? He and John are friends, not enemies, not bitter rivals, not angry at each other. So if you see something out there that's working, that you see that you can use to serve another community, go for it. But whatever it is, if I can inspire you to go out and take that next step, do that thing that matters to you, make that difference, then go do it. I'm going to stop ranting on it now. I've ranted on it for like 10 minutes, but that's the deal. Just go do it. Now I've got a couple of picks I'm going to throw out there. You can definitely go check them out. The first one is I've mentioned like Everywhere JS and Everywhere RB. Go check those out. That's part of my vision as far as like where we can go and how we can help people. And basically it's an online users group. We're going to have meetings once or twice a month, and we're just going to talk about stuff that you're interested in, get really cool, interesting people to come on board. The other pick that I have, so devchat.tv, I've been working on moving it over to a statically hosted site. I'm hosting it on Netlify. That's a pick. They're also a sponsor of some of the shows, full disclosure, but I freaking love what they've got. And so I talked to them and got them to sponsor. But yeah, I love it. They've got a lot of tools for kind of the static style sites that you might see from like Jekyll or Hugo. I'm using a system called 11D, and that's written in JavaScript. So 11D.js, you can find it at 11ty.io. That's 11 like 11T TY type. Anyway, so definitely check that out as well. But yeah, I freaking love this stuff. So I'm just trying to make an impact there. The DevChat 11D repo is on GitHub, so you can go make pull requests and stuff. I've been trying to get all the posts tagged and things like that. So if you want to help me with that, that's fine. And if you want some kind of coaching, that's actually really good way to get it. Because if you tag 5 posts or you write show notes for shows that don't have it for 5 posts, then I will actually just give you an hour of coaching for free. So anyway, just throwing all that out there, and that's at github.com/ I think CMAXW / devchat-11D. So anyway, really, really digging that. Really, really happy with the outcome. Just working on getting the final touches in. It'll probably be up this week. So as I record this, which is June 3rd. So anyway, if it's past this week, then it's probably already out there, and you're probably seeing the new DevChat. So anyway, those are my picks. That's my stuff. Get out there, figure out what you want, go after it, go do it, and then write your own journey. Have a good one.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.